Hey, good morning. I'm Neil. And this morning I'm paddling out on I'll call it the mouth of McAllister Creek as it empties into the Puget Sound right next to the Nisqually Reach. I love paddling over here. There's a bird sanctuary, lots of animals. And when I paddle, I kind of think back, what would it have been like 200 years ago? Just up what is now known as McAllister Creek. But in 1854, it was known by the settlers as Medicine Creek. And by the natives, as Shinanum Creek. So up the creek at a prairie, in 1854, December of 1854, the first territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, put out a request for the Indians to meet with him, about 7 tribes, and he forced upon them what was become known as the Medicine Creek Treaty. And unfortunately, it was really the start of the Indian Wars for 1855, 1856, here in the Puget Sound area. So, on this paddle, let's take a paddle back in time and explore the area and its history. Ezra Meeker, a pioneer who settled the Puyallup area just a little bit south of here. You may have heard of him as also being the Hop King, same person. He wrote that the war was brought on by the fact that the Indians had been wronged. He wrote, "This seems certain. They have been robbed of their lands by the treaty made in 1854, and there have been atrocious murders of Indians by irresponsible white men. The result was suffering and trouble for all of us." So let me try and set the scene going back a few years earlier to give this conflict some context. So if you go all the way back to just 1838, that's when London had granted the Hudson Bay Company permission to start up a new company, which was the Puget Sound Agricultural Company at Fort Nisqually, just a little bit farther away at Steilacoom. And the idea was that they were going to do farming and, peas, potatoes, corn were the main crops, and then raise cattle, sheep, and pigs. And in the area, pretty much between the Puyallup River and the Nisqually River, they had set aside, made claim to 160,000 acres with multiple farm sites, pens, and the others. Okay, move up to 1846, and you have the agreement between the United States and Britain on the border being moved up to the 49th parallel. So previously, you had the border at basically the Columbia River, where the British had the land north of the Columbia River, and the Americans had the land south of the Columbia River along the Pacific coast. And as part of that agreement, the Hudson Bay Company was allowed to stay on their property until such time that the United States government would agree to buy them out, essentially make purchase of their properties and what they had established here in the area. And then in 1849, the U.S. Army and Company, the 1st Artillery Group, leased some land from the Hudson Bay Company, and right there at Fort Nisqually. Then 1853, Washington Territory was established, and that basically divided what was known as the Oregon Territory, and Washington Territory became the Pacific coast north of the Columbia River. So back to Indians' treaties. 1789 going even further back, but the Northwest Ordinance by Congress tried to establish that we could have, well, that you had to go through the United States government to get land. You couldn't make individual deals with the Indians to try and settle the land that was claimed in the territories. You had to go through the U.S. government and make a claim. So the governor, very quickly after he arrived here in the Washington Territory, in Olympia, at the governor's mansion, he and a Mike Simmons, they wrote the treaty. There was no negotiations, no, talking with the natives first. They just went ahead and wrote the treaty of what they wanted to do. Now, Stevens was also nominated as the Indian administrator for this area. And he had the job of laying out the track for the Pacific Railroad. So he had a lot on his plate, and he was just going to get it done. And he really didn't know the people, the culture, the area. And the first thing he did was give them a very, very small 4,000 acres for on the order of 900 Indians. And he identified the area as a very heavy, timbered, rocky place that was unsuitable to support life for that many people. I mean, no farming. It was miserable. And then the Indians were very suspicious because in the articles, the president could reassign them and move them to another area just on his choosing, without consultation. And they were somewhat afraid that they were going to be sent to the land of darkness, the land with no sun, up in Alaska. The other thing is that they tried to, well, they did. They negotiated the treaty using the Chinook language, which was kind of the area trade language. But it only had like about 400, 500 words, very simple language. And it could not really explain the details of the treaty. In fact, there was an Indian Thai who was saying, why? Why would the Indians ever give up their land? They just didn't understand what it all meant. However, there was one leader of the Nisqually, and Leschi, who did understand what was going on, and he refused to take part. So on the second day of a 3-day powwow sort of thing, he tore up his commission paper, basically. The governor had assigned different Indians to be signatures on this treaty, because the tribes themselves really didn't have a very local, focused government. And so the governor gave Leschi a paper and said, hey, you're one of the signatures, you're one of the people that's in charge. Leschi tore up his commission and left the site. So after the signing of the Medicine Creek Treaty, Stevens continued to move north on the Puget Sound, trying to get other treaties signed. The Medicine Creek Treaty was sent to Washington, and it was actually approved by Congress that year. The biggest thing that Governor Isaac was trying to do was get these treaties signed. And so he went east of the Cascades to do more, going all the way to Blackfoot Indian Territory. So he was out of Olympia for almost a year. And during that time is when we start to have the conflicts. Miners were killed going to the Colville mines, and acting Governor Mason called up for volunteers, called up for one group to to go against the Yakima. And then he called up some others. And one of the groups was the Eaton Rangers. And he immediately sent them out to arrest Leschi. So Leschi and his brother, they took off. They got word that they were going to be arrested, and they left. So this Eaton Rangers, Charles Eaton was elected as captain, and James McAllister as a lieutenant, and they had a company that was 19 strong. But Lieutenant McAllister and member Connell, they were killed on 27 October 1855 in that effort to arrest Leschi. And then quickly, in quick order, there was the White River Massacre of 28 October 1855, in which 3 families were killed. Nine people and 3 families. And then on October 31st, 1855, a vanguard of American soldiers under the command of Captain Marcy Maloney, they were returning back over the Cascade Mountains, and 2 soldiers were killed, Abram Moses and Joseph Miles. And Leschi was blamed for that killing. And that happened on Connell's Prairie, which is now in the area of today's Bonnie Lake. Then Lieutenant William Slaughter led a detachment against the Indian stronghold on White River. While he was standing in a doorway, he was shot and killed. And then he was later buried at Nisqually Fort. So the fighting has started. And it kind of becomes a what was also known as the Blockhouse War. The white settlers established maybe 100 blockhouses in the Puget Sound area. The families would leave their farms, go to these blockhouses for safety. Women and children would go up on the 2nd floor. The men would stand guard on the 1st floor. Heavily timbered blockhouses for protection. So the war started up pretty quickly. Interesting, the governor, Douglas of Vancouver, he gave $5,000 support and supplies to Governor Mason, the acting Governor Mason. And then the Nisqually Fort, they provided $27,000 in supplies also. And this is because the uprising, the Indian uprising, had not been recognized by the U.S. Congress and had not been given any extra funding to support this uprising. So Leschi, he tried to organize, and he tried to say, if we just change some of the treaty conditions and the reservations so that he could keep his land. His land was, he was considered wealthy by Indian measures. Had some property where he would do some farming and ranching. He had quite a few horses, and he had also worked for the Hudson Bay Company. Leschi tried to get them to renegotiate the treaty to get a better reservation land, a reservation site, because where they were given just wasn't livable. But the governor refused, and he took it personal, and he hated Leschi, and he hated that the Indians would fight back. And so he was very determined to make them pay for this uprising. So Governor Stevens, he wanted his revenge on the Indians. And in a speech to the House of Representatives, he said, "The war shall be prosecuted until the last hostile Indian is exterminated. I am opposed to any treaties. I shall oppose any treaty with these hostile bands." And he gave the order in February of 1856, all Indians found in your field of operations are to be considered as enemies. And that led directly to the company led by Maxon of massacring approximately 30 Indians who were fishing at the time. And one of the witnesses, Robert Thompson, he said that of all the dead were but 2 men. Maxon also told Stevens that members who were part of the Hudson Bay Company who were now U.S. citizens. So they started here with the Hudson Bay Company. They then made claims with the U.S. They became U.S. citizens. And Maxon said that he couldn't do the war with these guys collaborating with the Indians. And so he wanted to bring them up on treason charges. Stevens responded to Maxon and gave the order to have them arrested on treason and brought in. Now these men, they got lawyers, and they were challenging their arrest. And so Stevens, in order to continue to hold them, put Pierce County and then Thurston County under martial law. And then it even got better. He was trying to prevent the courts from even opening up, of holding sessions. And so when the judge tried to hold session, he sent the volunteers to arrest the judge. And the judge, knowing that trouble was coming, he brought in men, kind of like deputized them, and had them protect the courthouse. So we almost had a fight between U.S. white settlers over the issue of martial law. And I see I got some seals sunning themselves just about straight ahead, and some blue herrings. I don't know if those might be too far away for the camera to pick up. Anyways, the judge, avoiding bloodshed, went ahead and stood down and was arrested by the volunteer company and taken to Olympia. And that was the Chief Justice at the time. Now, a little bit later, another judge tried to hold court, and I'm sorry, I'm so focused on these animals here. Got a blue herring to the left, and it looks like a seal sunning himself. I don't want to get too close. So anyways, another judge was trying to hold court, and he told the sheriff that he's going to need about 50 men, and he was ready to fight. And this time, a lieutenant of the volunteers thought better of it, and he pulled his men back and sent word back to Olympia saying, "We are at the point of shooting, essentially. What are your orders?" And in addition, the judge sent a letter to the governor saying that the governor at martial law did not have authority to bring such charges, that it was not within his authority to bring those charges. So the governor, Isaac Stevens, sent back a note saying, all right, I'm not under those authority, but under the Articles 56 and 57, I do have authority to arrest these men and try them. And so the judge said, okay, you do have authority under those articles. And he asked the men who were being held there in the courtroom, how do they plead? And they pleaded not guilty. But the governor then said he did not have the men or the officers available to take the time to hold a court-martial. And so those men were released. And that became the end of the story. There was never any more follow-up. But that effort of martial law pretty much brought down Governor Stevens. The Congress pulled his funding as a Indian administration, and he was chastised by the U.S. Attorney General. It did not go well for Stevens after that. Meanwhile, Leschi had moved over to eastern Washington with a small band that were still with him, and surrendered to Colonel Wright and said that he did not want to fight anymore. And so Colonel Wright said that if they had laid down his guns, laid down their arms, that he would protect them from any, well, he would put them under protection from the white settlers. Governor Stevens refused to resettle any of the Nisqually Indians that were east of the Cascades until Leschi and his brother were arrested. So Colonel Wright has Indians on his hands that he's protecting, really no additional funding, and can't get them back to the reservations and care on the Puget Sound because Isaacs refused to take them until he has Leschi in shackles. So Leschi comes back and he tries to, again, talk about renegotiating the treaty, and nobody will listen. And I'm going to go over to Fox Island in a little bit and give you the story of Fox Island, because Fox Island was used as a place for the Indians to be held in an internment camp during the war and really protect them from the volunteers and the white settlers. But that's a bigger story I want to do when I get over to Fox Island. In the meantime, Stevens was still trying to arrest Leschi, and one of his men was talking to Leschi's nephew, Slugia, and Slugia tricked Leschi and got him captured. And he is taken to Olympia and handed over to Governor Stevens. A few days later, Cumith, knowing that his brother's been arrested and held but not killed, gives himself up, and he is taken to Olympia. Unfortunately for Cumith, while being held in the governor's office, he is murdered by a relative of Lieutenant McAllister. That relative was arrested, charged with murder, but found not guilty. So Leschi brought up on murder charges for the killing of Moses. So in the first trial, the judge gave directions that if they found that Leschi was a warrior in a war, that as a combatant, he couldn't be found guilty of murder. So the first term of the first verdict to come back from the jury was a hung jury, and it was 8-4. They were sent back to talk more about it, and then the jury came back hung 8-2. Two men, Ezra Meeker and Father William Kincaid, voted that Leschi be not guilty because he was a combatant. Well, you knew Governor Stevens wasn't going to give up. So there was a second trial. And in the second trial, there was no mention of being that they were at war and that Leschi was a combatant. Those directions were never given to the jury. Secondly, there are a couple of men in the Army, and the Army was really upset about Leschi being tried as a murderer because they believed him to be a combatant. And they went and did a survey of the area murder, and the witness was saying that Leschi met them in the prairie, and then as they left the Indians and moved on towards Olympia, down the trail towards Puget Sound, they were attacked in the woods. They were ambushed. So these men who believed Leschi was not guilty went up there and surveyed the area and had what they consider proof that Leschi could not have beaten them to that point, that the other trail that was available to them was twice as long as the trail that they were on and rougher. That Leschi could not have been in the prairie and then moved to an ambush position that quickly. But for some reason, that was never brought up in trial. That information was not brought up in trial. And until Ezra Meeker's death, he believed that the only witness that was putting Leschi at that position was perjuring himself. So Leschi is has been found guilty of murder, sentenced for a hanging. There are appeals that are sent up to all the way to the Territory Supreme Court. He's not given any relief, and he's sentenced to be hung. Now, there are some shenanigans, very interesting. So the two men who were the sheriff and the Indian administrator, given the responsibility to take Leschi out of the jail at Fort Nisqually and hung, were arrested because somebody claimed that they were selling liquor to the Indians. And interesting enough, the hanging execution date was a date tying between, I believe it was 11 and 1 p.m. And those two men who were given the duty to be the executioner were in jail until 2 o'clock that day. And so they were unable to perform the execution. Oh, the uprising, the people were so mad about that. Anyways, they got a new execution date set up. And the Army and Lieutenant Colonel Casey said, "You will not hang this man at Nisqually Fort. You will not hang him on the property of the Army post. You must be at least 300 yards off the post for hanging, and none of my men will support the execution." So, February 4th, 1858, a new execution was set. And on February 19, 1858, Leschi was hung. In July of 1895, Leschi and Cumeth were reburied on the new Nisqually reservation. Based on a reservation that came out of the Fox Island Agreement. And I'll talk about that from Fox Island. Beautiful day here on the river. Lots of blue herring. I'm not sure if they're seals or sea lions. Probably got some eagles over there in the refuge. Very light breeze, sunny morning. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the paddle. A little bit of history. I hope to see you out on the water. Take care.